Hi there. I call this episode 002, the student leader they kidnapped. Why would armed men be afraid of a student leader? That's the question at the center of this case. Not a politician, not a military officer, not a journalist, a student leader. A man who had gone back to school later in life after years of working as a motorcycle mechanic. A man who had finally found a way to continue his education. A man who became Secretary General of a student council at a private small school in Mali. And within a few months, he was kidnapped. When I first began this consultation, the facts did not arrive in a clean, organized story. They almost never do. People imagine asylum cases beginning with someone sitting across from a lawyer and telling a dramatic story from beginning to end. But that's not usually how it happens. The truth often comes in fragments. A date that doesn't make sense. A school name that's hard to pronounce. A translator struggling through poor audio. A client answering in pieces because the story is painful, complicated, and far away. So the lawyer's job is not simply to listen. The lawyer's job is to discover. And discovery begins with small questions. When were you born? Were you raised? How many brothers and sisters do you have? What school did you attend? When did you graduate? What did you do after school? At first, these questions can seem almost too basic. But in an asylum case, basic facts are the foundation. If the foundation is weak, the entire case collapses. One of the first things we had to untangle was the timeline. At first, it sounded as though he had graduated in 2019, but the dates didn't fit the rest of the story, so we slowed down and started asking more questions. It turned out he had actually completed secondary school years earlier, around 2005. So what happened during all those years in between? His family couldn't afford to continue his education. Like many people around the world, he put his dreams on hold and went to work. For years, he earned a living repairing motorcycles, saving what he could until he finally had the opportunity to return to school. That detail matters more than it might seem. He wasn't just another student. He was older, more mature, someone his classmates respected. And so when the school elected a student council, they chose him as Secretary General. Now, at first glance, that title doesn't sound particularly important. But before this consultation was over, it would become one of the most important facts in this entire asylum case. The school had a student council, 5 members, a secretary general on the top, a vice president, and 3 organizers. He was the leader. The position was not powerful in a government sense. He did not set national policy. He didn't command anyone. His role was practical. If students had conflicts, he helped resolve them. If students stopped coming to class, he went to their homes and tried to convince them to return. Up to this point, this sounds like a story about a dangerous village. It isn't. It's a story of one man who unknowingly stepped into the middle of a conflict over education itself. Because in his village, school itself had become dangerous. The village was called Mordia. For years, rebel groups had been moving closer. At first, they were present in the region. Then they became more visible. Then the government began losing control. Little by little, the government disappeared. The mayor left. The police left. Public officials left. And wherever government disappears, someone else usually fills the vacuum. In this village, it was armed extremists. They came into the village with guns. They kidnapped girls. They took young men for military training. They imposed rules. Women could be beaten publicly for not covering properly. Modern clothing and cultural practices were forbidden. And then came the order that matters most in this case. No more French school. No more non-secular education. Only Quranic school. Schools that teach the Quran. That single order changed everything. That is the moment when this case stops being about general violence and becomes a story about a specific person in a specific conflict. The rebels didn't merely want to control territory. They wanted to control the future. And the future runs through schools. They communicated their orders at the mosque. They would come during prayer time, deliver the message, and leave. They didn't need to occupy every single house. They had camps around the village. They had weapons. They had fear. And that was enough. So when students stopped going to school, this client did what a student leader does. He encouraged them to return. He believed he was protecting education. The rebels believed he was organizing resistance. The rest of the case grows out of this difference. He went to students' homes. He told them, continue your education. He tried to keep his school alive. Now, from a distance, maybe you think that sounds like a small act. But in that village, at that time, encouraging students to return to secular school was not just encouragement, it was defiance. And this is why the earlier questions mattered. If I had just jumped straight to, were you kidnapped? We would have an event, but we would not have a case. The case is not just that armed men took him. The case is why they took him. The answer is that he became associated with resistance to their control over education. He was the person encouraging students to disobey that order. And that's what had to be discovered. Eventually, we reached the question I had been working toward all along. December 2019, the day my client was kidnapped. He was in accounting class. It was around 4 p.m. There were about 50 students in the classroom. Teacher was teaching. And then approximately 15 armed men stormed in. They were angry. Their message was direct. We told you not to come to school. We told you not to return to this classroom. Why did you disobey us? At first, they spoke to the students generally, but they already knew who he was. That was another important discovery. How did the rebels know he was the student leader? Because they gathered information in the villages. They asked who managed the schools, who organized the students, who was bringing people back to class against our orders. They knew it was him, the Secretary General. They knew he was the one encouraging students to return. So they called names. They took the teacher. They took him. They took 2 other students. And then they removed them from the school and took them away. This is a part of the asylum case that many people never see. Yes, the story is horrifying, but the legal work is careful. Where were you? What class? Exactly what time? How many students? How many armed men? What exactly do you remember them saying? Who were they addressing specifically? How do they know you? Who else was taken, if anyone? Why those people? You see, each question narrows the story. Each answer turns fear into evidence. So they took him from the school to the bush. He was tied up. He was held for about 3 months. The conditions? Brutal. Little food, sometimes only bread, sometimes plain rice, sometimes nothing. The same clothes day after day. No freedom to move. No real concern for whether he was sick, hungry, or in pain. The captors, they came, they went. Some watched the kidnapped men. Others returned to the villages to enforce their rules, check whether people were obeying Islamic law, and watch for any government or military response. He didn't describe it as living, but as surviving. As if they were waiting for the captives to die on their own. And then one evening, during a meal, when their hands were untied and the guards were not watching closely, he saw an opening. He ran into the bush. He hid. And he could see them searching for him. They looked for hours. He stayed hidden hour after hour until they gave up. And then he began moving from place to place through remote areas, hiding, searching for food, trying not to be seen. And he didn't immediately reach safety. And that's another point people often misunderstand. Escape is not the same as freedom. After escaping captivity, he still had to survive in a country where the same groups had networks across remote villages. He eventually made his way toward Bamako, but it took time. He hid from place to place. He looked for fruit, food, shelter, anything that would keep him alive. By around June of 2020, he finally reached Bamako. But even there, he did not feel safe. He worked small jobs. He saved money. He always looked behind and he stayed hidden. He did not live freely. He knew that the militia were still looking for him. And while he was trying to survive, the harm to his family sadly continued. His brother had also been kidnapped, not from the same classroom, but on the same day that he was kidnapped. The client learned later from someone who came to Bamako from the village, his brother was still missing. An uncle was killed sometime after the kidnapping and before the client left Mali. The school he had tried to keep open eventually closed. And that detail matters because it confirms the larger story. This was not a classroom disruption. The rebels' campaign against secular education succeeded. The school sadly did not remain open. The student leader was taken. The teacher was taken. The students were scattered. And the village lost another institution. Eventually, my client fled Mali. He didn't have a simple route to safety. He traveled to Brazil, then through South and Central America, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, and finally, the United States. And when he asked me whether he had a chance to win asylum, the answer was not yes, absolutely. The answer was this: you have a chance if the narrative becomes clear, credible, detailed, and corroborated. You see, that is the real work. Not just telling a sad story, not just saying I was harmed, but showing the structure of the case. Who was he? Why did they care about him? What did he do that placed him in danger? What did the persecutors want? Why couldn't the government of Mali protect him? Why couldn't he safely return? Why wasn't relocating somewhere in Mali sufficient? Why does this story fit within the rubric of U.S. asylum law? Only after the facts are clear do the legal categories begin to matter. In this case, the legal theories begins with a simple human fact. My client stood for secular education in a place where armed extremists were trying to destroy it. He was not targeted because he was merely present in a dangerous country. He was targeted because he was identified as a student leader who encouraged others to keep attending school after the rebels ordered them not to. That distinction can determine whether a case is seen as generalized violence or persecution connected to a protected group. And that is why the lawyers keep asking questions. Not to make the client relive pain for no reason. Not to be difficult, but because the difference between winning and losing may be hidden in a detail the client does not know is important. A date, a classroom, a title, a student council, a principal who trusted him, a visit to a student's home, a rebel announcement at a mosque, a school that later closed, an escape through the bush, a brother taken away the same day, a life spent hiding even after captivity ended. That is how an asylum case is built. Not from drama alone, from meaning. The world may see another asylum applicant. I see something different. A mechanic, an older student, a secretary general, a village abandoned by its government, a school that refused to disappear, a classroom invaded, a man whose commitment to education became an act of resistance. That is the story. And that is the lesson. In asylum law, the question is really just, what happened to you? The deeper question is, why did it happen to you? And sometimes the answer is hidden in the smallest title: Secretary General, student leader, a man who believed. And in that village, at that moment, that was enough to make him dangerous.